Welcome to Functional Philosophy. I'm Charles Tew. That's T as in tango, E as in echo, and W as in whiskey. This is episode number 10, and its title is The Connection Between Plato's Metaphysics and Epistemology, an illustration of the interconnectedness of philosophy. There's a difference between having a set of philosophical positions and having a philosophy. A philosophy is an integrated set of philosophical positions on all the major questions of philosophy. What you believe about the nature of reality affects what you believe about knowledge, and both of those affect what you believe about morality, and all three of those affect what you believe about politics. And there are more interconnections than just those. All things are connected. As Hegel said, the true is the whole. I'll do an episode in the future on why exactly that is, because it's fascinating. But for now, I want to give a concrete example from the history of philosophy of the principle of interconnectedness. It's crucial to be able to bring concretes to mind when talking about abstract issues, because you're abstracting from the concretes. You're analyzing the concretes to get your theory. So before I talk about the theory of interconnectedness in another show, I want you to be able to bring up an example in your mind that illustrates the fact of the principle clearly. So, I'm going to talk about Plato's view of reality and knowledge, and show how his views on both integrate, and how one led to the other, and how they acted reciprocally thereafter. It's not true that you have a view of reality over here, and then you have a view of knowledge over there, and you just think about them independently and see where you go. No, the issues are bound up together, and your views on one affect your views on the other, even if you don't realize it. So, you're going to learn a bit about Plato here, but what I want you to be paying attention to above all is not the content of his ideas, but how the content of his ideas in one area affected the content of his ideas in another area. This is primarily a lesson in the interconnectedness of all things, although of course Plato's ideas are interesting in their own right too. Plato's view of the nature of reality is intimately connected to his view of knowledge and how we acquire it. So what are Plato's ideas on metaphysics and epistemology, or in other words, on reality and knowledge? Plato believed that the world we live in is an illusory shadow realm, a funhouse reflection of the fundamental form of existence, which is in another dimension. He believed that materiality and multiplicity are attributes of our inferior derivative world, and that the true world consists of immaterial, singular entities, what he called forms. Each of the many material instances of a type of thing in our world take part in what in another world is a singular, immaterial form. So all of the horses in our world share in the form of horse, which resides in the world of forms. We have white horses, brown horses, fast horses, slow horses, horses with different temperaments, small horses, big horses, strong horses, weak horses, deformed horses, etc. These multiple, individuated horses that we see are the different colors of the rainbow, visible after the white light of the form of horse is refracted through a prism into our world. All of the dispersed colors are present in the white light, but separated out as they pass through the prism, just as the form of horse is one, but becomes many in our material world. That's the briefest summary of the world according to Plato. So what about knowledge? Plato believed that knowledge actually comes from remembering knowledge we used to have before we were born. In fact, we don't learn. We simply recollect what we knew before birth, when we were one with the forms in their world. We have an idea of horse. How did we get that idea? It doesn't really make sense, does it? All horses are different, after all. There are no two horses that are exactly alike in every way. So how can we have a concept of horse when none of them share the exact same attributes? How do we know that they all belong in the same category? That they're all the same kind of thing? since they're actually different in every single specific way. There's no attribute that's exactly the same from horse to horse. Every horse has a different number of hairs, and those hairs are all of slightly different lengths, and they have different colors, etc. How do we know to group them together then? Well, Plato said that we were once acquainted with the form of horse in the other world. When we see all these reflections of the form of horse, our memory is jogged, and we recall the form of horse. That's how we can form concepts even though nothing in our material world justifies them. We have concepts, and they make sense, but there would be no way to form them from the individuated multiplicity we see, so our concepts must therefore refer to singular, immaterial entities in some other reality. They obviously don't refer directly to anything in this one, but they're obviously correct, too, in their categorization of what we do see. The only solution is that they refer to something we don't see. Plato's supernaturalism and mysticism require each other. A world beyond this one requires a means of knowledge beyond sense perception and reason. And a mystical faculty must give knowledge of something beyond our world. It goes deeper than that, however. Plato's fundamental orientation was what Ayn Rand called the primacy of consciousness. He started with the mind and went from there, instead of starting with existence and going from there. When you believe that your consciousness alone gives you knowledge superior to what existence can give you, and that in fact existence distorts your cognition, then you look inward for answers instead of outward. That's exactly what Plato did. His view of existence was that existence as we know it is a derivative of forms, or ideas, or abstraction. Metaphysically, consciousness is the fundamental form of existence in his view, and material existence is a mere derivative of what are actually contents of consciousness. Even further, in my view, Plato probably derived his metaphysics from his epistemology, again inverting the hierarchy of existence and consciousness. His teacher, Socrates, had been the first person to integrate abstractly, to try to find the one in the many in the world of ideas rather than the world of material entities, as the pre-Socratics had. Plato must have become interested in the so-called problem of universals from Socrates, and taken it as a given that our abstract concepts are valid. That was his starting point. So the question was, with that premise, where do they come from? As I discussed earlier, the only explanation he could think of was that the universals, the things every concrete of a type has in common, is a bit of a supernatural entity in another world. So you can see, even the branches of philosophy are inverted in Plato's system. He took a particular form of abstract knowledge for granted, and then deduced the nature of reality from it. He simply assumed his epistemological principles and used them as his starting point. Instead of thinking that if he couldn't justify his concepts in reality, he couldn't use them, he decided that obviously his concepts were valid. And if he couldn't figure out how they fit with the material world, then there must be a non-material world that justifies them. So, it's not just that an otherworldly metaphysics, the world of forms, goes hand in hand with mysticism, Plato's recollection. The actual order of those two things is reversed too. It's not the primacy of existence, it's the primacy of consciousness. Plato infers that another world exists because concepts don't appear to him to reflect the real world. He deduces metaphysics from epistemology. The reversal of the hierarchy is interesting, but the main thing I want to make clear is that beliefs in one area of philosophy affect beliefs in other areas. You can see here how Plato couldn't just have had his epistemological theories in a void. He couldn't compartmentalize or contain them. He had to fit his other beliefs around them, including his beliefs about the nature of reality. The true is the whole. When you hold a position, its implications are going to come up somewhere else. and ultimately everywhere else. This episode was a little shorter than usual, but that just means I was able to get across what I wanted to in a way that cost you less time. As I said, I'll revisit the issue of the true as the whole from a theoretical perspective in a future episode. But I hope in this episode you were able to see the phenomenon, to get a visceral grasp of its existence. Before you begin studying botany, you have to see some plants, so you know the things you're analyzing, and you're not just floating and talking about some theoretical entity. You have to see that there's something to explain before you start trying to explain it. So I hope this episode teed you up for an explanation of the theory of epistemological interconnectedness. If you have any questions about the subject of today's show or anything within reason, then just send me an email at charles.a.2@gmail.com. You can also visit my website at charlestew.com. There you can find information on and links to everything I do, including ways to support this podcast if you think it's valuable. The biggest way you can support this podcast is by becoming a patron on patreon.com/charlestew. I have all kinds of rewards if you decide to do that, including tutoring if you contribute at a certain level. You can also leave reviews for this podcast wherever you happen to listen to it, such as iTunes. Those really are valuable, so if you can spare a couple minutes, please leave a review. Thanks for listening. Let's meet again in episode 11.